Imagine this. You're standing in the middle of a forest, the air thick with the scent of pine and earth. Everything feels calm, steady, like the world is holding its breath. Then, out of nowhere, a spark flickers, a tiny, glowing ember drifting on the wind. It lands on dry leaves, and before you can blink, the ground beneath you is ablaze. Flames roar up, smoke stings your eyes, and the heat presses against your skin. Your first instinct: run, scream, panic. But what if I told you that for every very thing that threatens to destroy everything could also be the key to building something stronger? What if, instead of running, you learned to face it, to stand tall in the chaos, and come out the other side, not just alive, but thriving? Life's like that forest. 1 minute, you're cruising along Job's good, relationships are solid, plans are on track, and then bam, the spark hits. Maybe it's a layoff notice slipped under your door, a doctor's call with bad news, or a betrayal that cuts deeper than you thought possible. Whatever it is, it's your fire. And here's the kicker: you don't get to choose when it starts, but you do get to choose what you do when it's burning all around you. That's where Stoicism comes in it, as some dusty old philosophy from ancient Rome, but as a practical, down-to-earth toolkit for facing the flames and coming out stronger. This is Facing the Fire: How to Thrive When Life Burns. It's a story about a regular guy named Jake, an American everyman just like you or me, who's about to get hit with the kind of heat that'd make anyone want to quit. But through the lens of Stoicism, Jake's going to show us how to not just survive the blaze, but to use it to forge a life worth living. So grab a seat, because this isn't just a story, it's a roadmap. Let's see how Jake faces his fire. Jake was 34, living in a small town just outside Denver. He had a decent job at a logistics company, a little house with a leaky roof he kept meaning to fix, and a routine that felt safe, predictable. He wasn't rich, but he was comfortable. Life was fine at great, not terrible, just fine. Then came the spark. It was a Tuesday, grey and cold, when his boss called him into the office. "Jake, I'm sorry, man," his boss said, avoiding eye contact. "Corporate's cutting costs. Your position's gone. Last day's Friday." Jake felt the air leave his lungs. 12 years at that job, 12 years of showing up early, staying late, hauling boxes in the snow, and now it was over. He walked out of the office in a daze, the words "last day's Friday" echoing in his head like a drumbeat. By the time he got home, the ember had landed. The fire was starting. Bills were due in 2 weeks. His savings, barely enough for a month. And the job market. He'd heard the rumor hundreds of applications for every opening. Panic clawed at his chest. What now? That night, Jake sat on his couch, staring at a blank TV screen, a cheap beer warming in his hand. His mind raced. I'm screwed. I'll lose the house. I'll end up on the street. What's the point of even trying? The flames were rising, and he could feel the heat. But then something shifted. A memory flickered semming he'd read a while back, a line from some old Roman guy named Marcus Aurelius. "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." It wasn't much, just a sentence, but it stuck. Jake didn't know it yet, but that was his first step toward facing the fire. The next morning, he woke up, still scared, still mad, but with a tiny spark of his own. Not the kind that burns you down, but the kind that lights a path. He grabbed a notebook and wrote down what he could control: his attitude, his effort, his next move. The job was gone. The economy was a mess. Those were the flames, and he couldn't put them out. But he could decide how to walk through them. That's Stoicism in a nutshell, pretending the fire isn't there, but choosing how you face it. Over the next few days, Jake started small. He didn't have a job, but he had time, so he used it. He polished his resume, not with some desperate rush, but with focus like a soldier sharpening his sword before battle. He called up old co-workers, not to beg for leads, but to ask how they were holding up, knowing connection might open doors later. And when the rejection emails rolled in 5, 10, 20, didn't let them fuel the fire of despair. Instead, he reminded himself of another Stoic idea, this one from Seneca. What need is there to weep over parts of life? The whole of it calls for tears. In other words, life's tough for everyone. The fire doesn't single you out, it just burns. The trick is not to take it personally, but the real test came a week later. Jake's landlord knocked on the door, a grim look on his face. Rent's going up next month, Jake. Market's crazy. I gotta keep up. Another ember in the blaze. Jake's stomach dropped. He could barely cover the current rent, let alone more. That night, he sat with his notebook again, the panic whispering in his ear. Then he wrote, I can't control the rent hike. I can control where I live. It hit him maybe this was a chance to move, to rethink everything. The fire wasn't just burning his old life down. It was clearing space for something new. Jake's notebook was starting to look like a battlefield edges scratched with job leads, crossed out ideas, and little Stoic reminders like focus on the now, and the obstacle is the way. It had been 2 weeks since the layoff, and the fire wasn't dying down. If anything, it was growing. Rejection emails piled up in his inbox like ash, each one a little jab. We've decided to move forward with another candidate. Thanks for applying, but his savings were shrinking. The rent hike loomed like a storm cloud, and the quiet of his house felt less like peace and more like a cage. The flames were fanning themselves now, and Jake could feel the heat creeping into his thoughts. One morning, he sat at his kitchen table, staring at a cold cup of coffee. The job hunt was brutal. He'd applied to dozens of place-weary houses, delivery gigs, even a gas station clerk job he was overqualified for nothing. His phone buzzed with a text. From his buddy Mike, heard about a warehouse opening in Boulder. You in, Jake's gut twisted. Boulder was an hour away. It'd mean moving, uprooting everything. Plus, the pay was barely above minimum wage. Is this what I'm worth now, he thought. 12 years, and I'm back to square one. The fire roared. Louder, self-doubt, fear, frustration all feeding the blaze. That's when he flipped open his notebook and saw the Marcus Aurelius quote again. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. He read it twice, letting it sink in. The job market wasn't his to control. The rent hike wasn't his fault. Even the way he felt worthless Angrithat wasn't the fire itself. It was the smoke he was letting choke him. Jake took a deep breath and wrote, I can't choose the flames, but I can choose how I stand in them. It wasn't a fix, but it was a lifeline. Later that day, Jake called Mike back. Tell me about the Boulder gig, he said, keeping his voice steady. Mike filled him in long hours, hard work, but steady pay. Not glamorous, but it was something. Jake hung up and sat with the idea. Moving to Boulder meant leaving his leaker-roof house, his routines, his comfort zone. It felt like the fire was forcing his hand. Then another Stoic idea hit him, something he'd stumbled across online from a guy named Epictetus. It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. The rent hike, the layoff, the job in Boulder weren't good or bad on their own. They just were. What mattered was what he did with them. So Jake started to shift his lens. Instead of seeing the move as a defeat, he asked himself, what if this is a chance? Boulder wasn't just a warehouse. Jobit was a fresh start. Cheaper rent, new people, maybe even a shot at something better down the line. The fire wasn't punishing him. It was pushing him. He grabbed his laptop and started searching for apartments, not with dread, but with a flicker of curiosity. That night, he slept better than he had in weeks note, because the problems were gone. But because he'd stopped fighting the flames and started walking through them. But the fire wasn't done testing him. A few days later, Jake got a call from his mum. "Your dad's not doing great," she said, her voice tight. "The doctor says it's his heart. We're waiting on tests." Jake's chest tightened. His dad, Graf, stubborn, the guy who'd taught him how to change a tire and never back down, was suddenly fragile. The hospital was 3 hours away, and Jake didn't have a job to take time off from, but he also didn't have cash for gas or a hotel if it dragged on. The flames leapt higher, licking at his resolve. He drove out that weekend anyway, the old truck rattling down the highway. At the hospital, he found his dad in a bed, hooked to machines, looking smaller than Jake remembered. "Hey, kid," his dad rasped, managing a grin. "Heard you got canned. Tough break." Jake forced a laugh, but inside, the fire was raging worry for his dad. Guilt for not being there more, fear of what might come next. Sitting by the bed, he felt the weight of it all pressing down. That's when he remembered something else from Seneca. We suffer more often in imagination than in reality. Jake was picturing the worst, this dad gone, himself broke and alone, but none of that had happened yet. Right now, his dad was here, cracking weak jokes. Right now, Jake had enough gas to get home. The fire was real, but he was making it bigger in his head. He squeezed his dad's hand and said, "We'll figure it out, Pop." And for the first time, he meant it not as a wish, but as a choice. Back home, Jake doubled down. He took the Boulder Job, packed his stuff into boxes, and found a cheap studio apartment with a view of the mountains. It wasn't much, but it was his. The move was Kaya slugging furniture in the rain, sleeping on a mattress on the floor, but every ache in his back felt like proof he was still in the fight. On his first day at the warehouse, he showed up early, worked hard, and kept his head down. The fire hadn't gone out. Money was tight. His dad's tests were still pending, but Jake was learning to stand in it. One night, after a long shift, he sat on his tiny balcony, the cold air biting his face. He pulled out his notebook and wrote, "Amor fati." He'd found the phrase on Latin for love your fate. It was Stoicism at its rawest. Don't just accept the fire, embrace it. The layoff, the move, his dad's healthy were his story. Now, not some curse to escape. The flames weren't here to destroy him. They were here to shape him. And for the first time, Jake felt a quiet strength growing where the panic used to be. Jake's new life in Boulder was starting to take shape, like metal glowing in a blacksmith's fire. The studio apartment was cramped, the warehouse job was grueling, and the mountain air was colder than he'd expected. But there was something about it, something alive. He'd faced the flames of the layoff, the rent hike, and his dad's health scare, and he was still standing. Not just standing, even moving forward. The Stoic ideas he'd scribbled in his notebook weren't just words anymore. They were tools, hammers and tongs he was using to shape himself in the heat. But the fire wasn't done with him yet. It never is. His first week at the warehouse was a grind. The place smelled like diesel and sweat, and the shifts were 10 hours of hauling boxes, scanning labels, and dodging forklifts. Jake didn't mind the work'd always been a hands-on guy, but the crew was another story. Most of them were younger, cliquey, and quick to size him up. New guys slow, he overheard one mutter during a break. Another smirked and said, "Hope he lasts longer than the last one." Jake clenched his jaw, the old sting of rejection flaring up. He wasn't slow, was just learning the ropes, but the words stuck anyway, fanning the flames of doubt. That night, he sat on his balcony, the notebook open in his lap. The mountains loomed dark against the sky, and the chill bit at his knuckles. A more fatty, he'd written last time, "Love your fate." But loving this, the sore back, the snide comments, the feeling of being the odd man out, that was harder. He flipped back to an earlier page and saw something from Marcus Aurelius. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. It clicked. The crew's attitude, the job's grindy, weren't just obstacles. They were the forge. The fire was heating him up, and now it was time to hammer. The next day, Jake went in with a plan. He couldn't control the crew's opinions, but he could control his effort. So he doubled down, moved faster, asked questions, memorized the layout. When a pallet jammed the conveyor, he jumped in to fix it without waiting to be told. One of the guys, a wiry kid named Tony, raised an eyebrow. "Not bad, old man," he said, half grinning. It wasn't much, but it was a crack in the wall. Jake didn't need their approval, wasn't there to make friends, but he saw it for what it was, proof that action could shift the tide. Still, the real test came a week later. His supervisor, a gruff guy named Carl, pulled him aside. "Look, Jake, you're doing okay, but we're overstaffed. Gotta cut hours. You're down to 3 shifts next week." Jake's stomach sank. 3 shifts meant half the paycheck he'd been counting on. The rent was due soon, and his dad's next. Hospital bill was looming. The fire flared up again, hotter than before. He nodded at Carl, mumbled a thanks for letting me know, and walked out to his truck, the weight of it pressing on his chest, sitting in the cab. He let the panic wash over him for a minute, just a minute. Then he grabbed his notebook. "What can I control?" he wrote. Not Carl, not the hours, not the bills piling up. But he could control his next step. He remembered something from Seneca. There is no easy way from the earth to the stars. Life wasn't supposed to be smooth. The fire wasn't a punishment, it was the process. Jake started brainstorming. Could he pick up side work, sell some stuff he didn't need, cut costs? The flames were high, but he wasn't ashes yet. That weekend, Jake got practical. He listed his old TV and some tools on Craigslist, stuff he'd clung to from his old life. Made a quick $200. He switched to cheaper coffee, ditched the streaming subscriptions, and started cooking bulk meals with rice and beans. It wasn't glamorous, but it bought him breathing room. Then he hit the pavement, asking around town for odd job, shoveling snow, fixing fences, anything. A neighbor hired him to clear a driveway, and word spread. By Sunday, he'd scraped together another $150. It wasn't a fortune, but it was high through grit, not luck. Back at the warehouse, he kept showing up, even with the cut hours. He didn't sulk or slack off, worked like every shift was an audition, and it paid off. One day, Tony sidled up during a break. "Heard you're hustling side gigs," he said. "My cousins got a landscaping crew. They need a guy. You interested?" Jake nodded, keeping it cool. "Yeah, hook me up." A week later, he was pulling weeds and hauling dirt on weekends, doubling his income. The fire had forced him to adapt, and now it was forging him into something tougher. Then came news from home. His mum called late one night, her voice steady but tired. Dad's tests came back. "It's not as bad as they thought, just a blockage. They're doing a procedure next week. He'll be okay." Jake let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. The fire hadn't spared him, but it hadn't won either. He drove down to see his dad the next day, and there he was still gruff, still stubborn, cracking jokes about the hospital food. "Tough times, huh, kid?" his dad said. Jake grinned. "Yeah, but I'm tougher." Driving back to Boulder, Jake felt the shift, the layoff, the move, the warehouse. His dad was all fire, but it was also fuel. He pulled out his notebook that night and wrote, "The forge doesn't break you, it shapes you." He was starting to see it now. Stoicism wasn't about dodging the flames or pretending they didn't hurt. It was about stepping into them, letting them burn away the weak parts, and coming out stronger. The crew's jabs, they'd pushed him to prove himself. The cut hours, they'd forced him to hustle. His dad's scare, it had reminded him what mattered. The fire was his teacher, and he was learning fast. Jake was starting to feel the rhythm of the forge. The warehouse job, the side hustles, the small Winsty were hammering him into shape, and the metal was holding. 6 weeks into Boulder, things were looking up. Tony's cousins, landscaping. Gig turned steady weekends of mowing lawns and trimming hedges, cash in hand. His dad was home from the hospital, grumbling about the low-sodium diet, but alive and kicking. Even at the warehouse, the crew was warming up. Carl, the supervisor, had noticed Jake's hustle and bumped him back to full shifts. "Keep it up," Carl grunted, which was about as close to praise as he got. For the first time in months, Jake felt the fire easing, not gone, but manageable, like a controlled burn. Then came the spark of something bigger. One afternoon, Carl called him over. "Got a lead position opening up," he said, scratching his beard. "More responsibility, Shenchel, training newbies, pays better. You in?" Jake's pulse quickened. A promotion after all the scrambling. This felt like a crack of daylight through the smoke. He nodded. "Yeah, I'm in." Carl clapped him on the shoulder. "Good, starts Monday." That night, Jake sat on his balcony, the mountains glowing pink in the sunset, and let himself smile. The fire had pushed him here to a place where he wasn't just surviving, but climbing. Monday rolled around, and the lead role hit the ground, running. Jake was now the guy telling the crew where to stack boxes, showing rookies how to scan without jamming the system, and keeping the shift on track. It wasn't e-scythe. Hours were longer, and the crew didn't love taking orders from the new guy, but Jake leaned into it. He remembered Marcus Aurelius. What need is there to praise yourself for doing what you're made to do? This wasn't about ego, it was about purpose. The fire had tempered him, and now he was proving it. For a couple of weeks, it worked. The extra pay padded his bank account, enough to cover rent and send a little to his folks. The crew settled into a grudging respect, and Jake started to feel like Boulder was home. But fires don't stay tame forever. One Friday, he was finishing a shift when Carl pulled him aside again. "Bad news," Carl said, his face tight. Corporates auditing. They're cutting costs again. Lead position might not stick. Jake blinked. What's that mean? Carl sighed. Means it's temporary for now. Could go either way. Hang tight. The words landed like a fresh ember. Temporary, after all that. Jake drove home, the truck's engine rumbling in time with his thoughts. The fire was back and certain, unpredictable, licking at the edges of his newfound stability. That night, he paced his tiny apartment, the notebook untouched on the table. What's the point? He thought. I claw my way up, and it's still not enough. The flames of frustration roared, and for a moment he let them. He was tired of hustling, tired of the rug getting yanked out from under him, but then he stopped. He grabbed the notebook and flipped to a line from Epictetus. You become what you give your attention to. If he fed the frustration, that's what he'd become, bitter, stuck. If he fed the effort, the focus, he'd stay in the fight. The fire wasn't new. It was just hotter now, and he'd faced hotter, he wrote. The tempering isn't over. It's making me sharper. The lead role wasn't gone, yet just uncertain. He could still show up, still prove his worth. The fire wasn't breaking him. It was testing the edge he'd built. The next week was a crucible. Jake threw himself into the lead role like it was his last stand. He streamlined the crew's workflow, caught errors before they hit Carl's desk, and stayed late to train a nervous newbie who kept dropping boxes. Tony noticed. You're busting your ass for a maybe, he said one day, tossing Jake a water bottle. Jake shrugged. It's not about the maybe, it's about the now. Tony smirked. Deep man. But Jake meant it. Stoicism wasn't about guarantees, it was about doing what you could, when you could, no matter the outcome. Then the blaze spiked. Midweek, Jake got a call from his mum. Your dad's back in the ER, she said, her voice shaky. Chest pain again. There. Keeping him overnight. Jake's heart thudded. He'd thought they were past this. He told Carl he needed a day, drove the 3 hours in a blur, and found his dad in a hospital bed, pale but stubborn as ever. False alarm, his dad muttered. Just indigestion. Docs are paranoid. Jake laughed, relief flooding him, but the scare lingered. The fire wasn't letting up, it was tempering him on all fronts. Back in Boulder, he walked into the warehouse the next day, bleary-eyed but determined. Carl met him at the door. Audit's done, he said. Lead position safe. You're keeping it. Jake exhaled, the tension unwinding like a coiled spring. Thanks, Carl. Carl nodded. You earned it. Crew's better with you around. It wasn't a big speech, but it was enough. The fire had tested him how his cut, Dad's health, the uncertainty, and he'd held the line. That night, Jake sat on his balcony, the notebook in hand. The mountains were dark, the air crisp, and he felt solid. Not invincible fires don't leave you that, but tempered, like steel cooled after the heat. He wrote, the fire doesn't promise you'll win. It promises you'll grow. He thought about the layoff that started it all, the move, the hustle, the scares. Each flame had hurt, but each had shaped him. Seneca had it right. Difficulties strengthen the mind as labor does the body. Jake wasn't the same guy who'd sat on that couch in Denver, drowning in panic. He was tougher, sharper, ready for the next blaze. Here's the final part of your story, facing the fire. How to thrive when life burns, for the daily Stoic mindset. This is segment 5. The flame endures, bringing Jake was feeling the weight of the tempered steel he'd become. The lead role at the warehouse was his, the side hustles were steady, and his dad was back home, grumbling about kale smoothies but stable. Boulders mountains stood like silent sentinels outside his window, a reminder of how far he'd climbed. The fire hadn't gone out, he never dozed, but Jake had learned to walk through it, to let it shape him instead of scorch him. He thought he'd seen the worst of the blaze. He was wrong. It started with a phone call on a quiet Thursday. Tony's voice crackled through the line. Urgent. Jake, warehouse got hit last night. Break-in, equipment's trashed, inventory's gone. Carl's freaking out. Jake's stomach dropped. What's that mean for us? Tony hesitated. Means we're shut down till they figure it out. Could be weeks, maybe longer. The line went dead, and Jake stood there, phone in hand, the ember landing fresh. Weeks without work. He'd just gotten his feet under him, rent covered, a little, savings, bills paid. Now the fire was roaring back, hotter than ever. He drove to the warehouse anyway, needing to see it. The parking lot was Chowscops, flashing lights, the crew milling around like lost dogs. The big bay doors hung open, and inside it was a mess. Broken crates, scattered tools, the conveyor belt smashed. Carl was barking orders at no one in particular, his face red. Insurance'll take forever, he muttered when he saw Jake. Might not reopen if they don't pay out. Jake nodded, the heat of it sinking in. No job, no income, no warning. The fire wasn't just testing him now, it was daring him to break. That night, Jake sat on his balcony, the notebook open but blank. The mountains were swallowed by darkness, and the cold gnawed at his fingers. His mind raced. Rents due in 10 days. Savings won't last. What if it's months? The flames of panic licked at him, familiar but fierce. He could feel the old Jake creeping back, one who'd sat on that couch in Denver, paralyzed. Then he stopped. He grabbed a pen and wrote, "The fire's not new. I am." He'd faced worse and come out stronger. This wasn't the end, was another turn in the forge. He flipped to a line from Marcus Aurelius he'd jotted down weeks ago. If it's endurable, then endure it. Don't complain. The warehouse was gone for no fact. Money was tight fact. He couldn't control the break or the insurance, but he could endure. More than that, he could act. Jake started listing what he could do. Lean on the landscaping gig, hunt for temp work, cut costs even further. The fire was high, but he wasn't ash, not yet. The next day, Jake hit the ground running. He called Tony's cousin and took every landscaping shift he couldn't done to dusk, hauling mulch and digging trenches, his hands blistered but his head clear. He scoured job boards, applied to anything local, retail, delivery, construction. By midweek, he'd landed a part-time gig stocking shelves at a hardware store, low pay, but steady. He sold his truck's spare tire and some old camping gear online, scraping together enough to cover rent. It was bare bones, living rice and beans again, no extras bet. He was holding the line. The crew started texting to, "Tony, you hear anything? Another guy, this sucks, man." Jake didn't have answers, but he had something else. He invited them over, Tony, the newbie, a couple others for beers on the balcony. It wasn't much, just a six-pack and some folding chairs, but it mattered. "We'll get through it," Jake said, keeping it simple. "One day at a time." Tony nodded. "You're weirdly calm about this." Jake laughed. Not calm, just not quitting. It was Stoicism, in action, not flashy, but real. Epictetus had nailed it. It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. The fire was burning them all, but Jake was showing them how to stand in it. Weeks dragged on, and the warehouse stayed dark. Rumors swirled reopening soon, maybe never. Jake kept grinding, the hardware store gig stretching to full time as the holidays neared. His dad called one night, voice gruff but warm. Heard about your job. You okay, kid? Jake smiled. Yeah, Pop. Tough, but I'm good. His dad chuckled. Always were a stubborn bastard. It was the closest thing to a compliment he'd get, and it hit deep. The fire had taken a swing at his family, his work, his stability, and he was still here. Then, a break. Carl texted the crew. Insurance came through. Reopening next month. Leads keep their spots. Jake read it twice, the relief sinking in. Slow. He'd made it, bridged the gap, kept the roof over his head, stayed in the fight. The fire hadn't won. He sat down that night and wrote, "The flame endures." But so do I. Seneca's words echoed. Fire tests, gold, adversity tests, the strong. He'd been tested, burned, tempered, and he'd come out gold. Jake's story isn't over fires, never stop coming, but he's learned the secret. Thriving isn't about dodging the blaze. It's about facing it, letting it refine you, and walking out stronger. That's Stoicism, some highbrow theory, but a gritty, everyday way to live. The layoff, the move, the break in thee were flames, sure, but they were also fuel. Jake's still in Boulder, still leading at the warehouse, still scribbling in that notebook, and when the next ember lands, he'll be ready. So what about you? Got a fire burning in your life? Stick around with the daily Stoic mindset. I'm here to share stories like Jake's, real, raw, and packed with Stoic wisdom to help you thrive when life burns. Hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, and join me next time. We'll face the flames together.